Hello YouTube.
What's up guys, Enkiri here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about deloads. More specifically, I'm going to respond to a recent video made by Natural Hypertrophy titled, Why I Never Deload and You Shouldn't Either. And it's an interesting concept overall. I don't really agree with the title here. I don't agree with the video at face value based on the title here, but I just finished editing my intro just now. I responded to what I thought were the most interesting and important parts of NH's video, and then I kind of went back afterwards and I amended my intro here once I got through it. So I kind of did things backwards here because, as we're going to come to find out shortly, Natural Hypertrophy does actually deload, and he does actually believe that you should deload too. So his title ends up being a little bit of a misnomer, but I think that there were a lot of interesting tidbits there, a lot of interesting pieces in that video that were worth talking about, and so that's really what I want to do today. And I'm just going to kind of jump in here right now and just get things started. Now, I'm not going to show every single point that he makes in his video because it was a 38-minute long video, and if I were to end up responding to everything in that video, mine would end up probably being over an hour long, and this video already ended up being way longer than I wanted it to be, so just as a heads up. But if you guys want, you can go check out his video if you want more context. It's linked below in the description. So let's just get to it.
You might have heard me say that I personally don't deload, and I consider deloads to be suboptimal for bodybuilding. What I never do is I never take a week off, I never reduce the load on my exercises, so I never sandbag on purpose, at least never by taking 100 pounds off of the bar on deadlift, for example. I never take rest days outside of Sundays, and I also never train too far from failure. And that is for every single exercise, for training sessions that go from 2 to 3 hours every single day.
He trains a lot, right? That's a lot of hours, it's a lot of sessions, and in total it is a lot of work. And he must love doing it because, here's the thing, the deload topic notwithstanding, in my opinion, that is a somewhat unnecessary amount of time to be putting into the weight room, right? Especially when hypertrophy is the only training goal. You're talking 2 to 3 hours per day, 6 days per week, so maybe 18 hours, 15 to 18 hours, something in that time frame probably, when you average everything out. And I just don't think that that is a requirement for making, I don't think that that is the way to make optimal progress. Not only is it not a requirement, I think it's actually in some ways a hindrance. But so what I want to say here is just for this singular point, I want to present a quick hypothetical and kind of play devil's advocate on myself. And I want to say, we'll propose that maybe this workload in and of itself doesn't set him back, right? Maybe his entire premise here is correct and he doesn't need to deload. We'll get to that later. He doesn't need to deload and he can progress optimally with this really large workload and this large amount of hours put in. Okay, but then I have to ask, why would you want to do this? It's wholly unnecessary for making optimal progress, right? So why would I want to spend this much time in the gym, right? Like, yes, training is fun, and I personally derive satisfaction directly from the process itself, but to me, this kind of thing, it has the makings of sounding kind of like dopamine addiction in some ways, right? More so than it sounds like optimized training, right? You're using the training itself at that point to make yourself feel good, but in the process of that, you are doing it to an excessive degree, you're doing it to unnecessary excess. And in the process of that, you're kind of losing sight of the primary purpose of why you're doing it in the first place. And for him, maybe for him, that's cool, right? He says he's getting bigger and bigger every year, and I'm just gonna take his word for that. But I still think that he could, at a minimum, he could make the exact same amount of gains in probably half that much time. And personally, and I'm sure that many of you, or at least some of you will agree with this, I would rather just do other shit, right? I'd rather optimally stimulate my training gains in the most efficient fashion possible and then just go and live my life, man. Hang out with my friends, play sports, play video games, or whatever. But why spend all that extra time unnecessarily training with weights? Because 18 hours a week in the gym, it's kind of overkill.
And when they misuse it the worst, it leads to the complete deload week, which is when people take a week off. It really is not optimal, even for powerlifting, to just do nothing. Most everyone who deloads nowadays and who take a week off don't really take a week off. They train, but with sub-maximal loads.
So yes and no here. So I don't actually schedule deloads for myself or for most of my clients, right? Typically, we kind of let life handle it, right? We just go, we run through the program and we run through the progressions. And then when life forces time off, we just kind of take it and we let that create its own recovery in the process of that. Or we do take some time off if the person is starting to feel bogged down or feel like they're not recovering well and they feel like they really need that time off. And during these periods of time, these forced deloads or these chosen deloads, but they're not scheduled, but they are chosen, I try not to be too anal here, right? I don't really care if you're working out at that time. I don't really care if you're doing anything. If you want it to be total rest, let it be total rest, man. Most people aren't competitive powerlifters. They're not lifting competitively. They don't need to stay in the gym and do sub-max work to keep their motor patterns sharp or whatever. And in the end, in the long run, it all kind of averages out. It doesn't really matter. And I'm the same way in my own training. It just doesn't really matter. So like these motor patterns, they'll come back after a couple weeks. If you've been doing this for years on end, you won't really even miss a beat, to be honest. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm a fan of the total rest approach either. I don't typically take that method with myself. For example, I try to always stay active because it helps keep me sane, just for example. But like I said, I try not to be too anal retentive about it. So if I'm traveling, at this point, I don't even bother really going to real gyms anymore, right? I just go to the hotel gym and I fuck around for a little bit. Just do something to stay active. They've always got at least some light dumbbells. They've got machines, they've got treadmills, whatever you want to do. I was doing loaded carries walking up a Stairmaster a couple weeks ago when I was in a hotel gym. So like I said, I try not, and you can just go outside and run, dude. Like you can do anything. I try to stay active, but I try not to be too anal retentive about it. So about my progressions and about my pet exercises. And this is, even though you're staying active, this is still in and of itself a form of deloading, both physically and psychologically. You're switching things up, you're changing things up. And so with clients, even if it's not a formal deload, one thing that I'll do is I will rotate them through exercise variations relatively often, right? So they're kind of deloading in disguise. A lot of times they don't even know it. Or if I'm keeping an exercise in the rotation, in the program, then I'll decrease the intensity and then we'll rebuild from there. And so it ends up being kind of a wave, right? You're going up and then you're coming back down, then you're going up a little bit higher, and then you're coming back down not so low as you were the last time. But still, that's effectively a form of deloading as well. And I haven't watched NH's whole video yet, right? Like I said, or like I alluded to a minute ago, I'm just kind of going through it bit by bit and taking notes as I go along and hear things that I think are important. But I have a feeling, I have a hypothesis right now that he's going to end up going down a rabbit hole of telling you something similar to this, that when things start to get stale or something starts to feel like it's beating you up, that what you should do, that was really loud. Sorry guys, I'm in a hotel right now, ironically enough, can't really help it. Anyway, so I have a feeling that what he's gonna say is what you should do when that kind of thing starts to happen is switch exercises, rotate through variations when things get stale. And that in and of itself forces reductions in weight because you're moving to things that you're unfamiliar with, and it, forces reductions in the internal training intensity, the way things feel for your body, the level of exertion that you're able to put out changes, and that changes the impact that it has on your body when you move from something more familiar to something less familiar. And so you're deloading simply by the nature of changing modalities, right? And I think that that's something that he's probably gonna walk down as we get towards the end of his video, if my hunch here is right. And so if that is the case, then this entire video that I'm making right now is probably largely pointless, because then we're just arguing over semantics, essentially, right? Where he wouldn't be calling that deloading, whereas I am calling that deloading semantics. But we'll see what happens.
Or if people are going to deload from an amount of work that did not justify a deload. So instead of reducing the load during that 1 week, what I'm going to tell you to do is to reduce the load prior to the deload week, so as to make sure it doesn't have to happen.
So you want them to deload before they deload.
You have to have your mind set on something in particular. Do you want strength or do you want muscle size? Do you want to get bigger? If that is the case, then the type of deload that I just described simply isn't going to work for you.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of trying to separate these concepts, separating training for strength and training for size, right? Because they're complementary adaptations. They drive each other, right? Now, I focus primarily on building leg strength rather than leg size for many, many years, for most of my training career. And my legs are pretty big, right? I focus primarily on building lat strength, primarily on building a big chin up, rather than building lat size for most of my training career. And my lats are pretty big, right? Because these are complementary things. Strength and hypertrophy are complementary. They don't cancel each other out. Rather, they drive each other forward.
That type of deload doesn't promote recovery. Let me explain. You take a week off, so you're going to do submaximal work. And you believe that because you do that, it lets your muscles recover to the max, which then, if we follow the same logic, allows you to trash the muscle to a maximal extent. I have heard that a million times by people who tell me that because I don't deload, this means that I never actually go to full failure. I never actually stimulate the muscle to the max. That is wrong for one reason. Your muscle doesn't need a full week off to recover. Your muscle needs around 48 hours. You can extrapolate that to 72 hours if you so wish. But at the end of the day, even a muscle that was trashed to the max will be fresh again in 4 to 5 days. Meaning that this entire idea that the entire body will require the week off is in reality outdated.
But it's not outdated. And for me, this point really underscores the importance of the nervous system, right? Because without the nervous system, none of this stuff happens, man. And that the nervous system, it's not just about building strength, right? The nervous system literally controls everything. It's the command center of the body. Your muscles don't even contract without the nervous system telling them to do so. And so what NH is describing here is more akin to the concept of peripheral fatigue, right? Fatigue that's localized to a muscle or to a group of muscles. But unless all that you're doing is isolation work, single joint stuff like lateral raises and curls and knee extensions, then peripheral fatigue is not your only concern. You also have to be concerned about central fatigue. And if you're doing any taxing compound exercises like squats or deadlift variations, or even bench pressing with any level of gusto, at least any level of gusto that would be required to actually build muscle, then you are creating inroads into the nervous system in that regard. You are creating central fatigue, and that central systemic fatigue affects the muscles on a local level. It's like a trickle-down effect, right? And that in turn impacts the training stimulus that you're able to create, which in turn impacts the gains that you're able to make. Now, do you need to take a whole week off, right? A whole week from the weights, total rest from the weights, or even just an entire week of switching things up in order to allow for all that accumulated fatigue to dissipate? Probably not, unless you've really, really run yourself into the ground. But you do ultimately need to take some form of deload at some point in time, which is a point that NH has basically already conceded at this point in his video. And fatigue management is something that he talks about a lot here, is also a great concept. And so I'm glad that he keeps bringing it up, because it is one of the most important things that you can learn how to do in order to extend your training blocks and keep your progress that you're making sustained for as long as possible. But it's also important to note that this chronic fatigue, this accumulated fatigue, is likely also going to affect your injury risk, right? Personally, I've only ever experienced a few noteworthy injuries in my career, in my training career, almost 15 years now. Maybe it is, I'm freaking old. I think it's more than 15 years, or at least it's 15 years on the nose, something like that. It might even be 16. I don't know. I can't remember anymore, Sonnies. But I've only ever experienced a few noteworthy injuries in my training career. And every single time that one of them occurred, it was during times where I was pushing things really hard without much regard for the level of fatigue that I had accumulated at that point in time, right? Because with the right mindset, the right is a relative term here, with the right mindset and the right willpower, you can at times override what the body is telling you, right? I've done that myself many times. It's not something I would advise you to do, but if you really, really want it, you can often tell your body to shut the fuck up, right? I'm doing this whether you like it or not. And most of the time, if you get bullheaded enough, you can do it. And you can generally make it out unscathed. Sometimes, though, your body reminds you that what it was warning you about, that it was warning you about something for a reason, and that reason was that you were carrying too much fatigue, and that fatigue can lead to injury. Now, this would be an example of improper fatigue management. So, the way I see it, you can think of the deload kind of as an insurance policy in that regard, right? You don't always feel this fatigue that you're carrying, and sometimes it can come back and bite you in the ass. And so a periodic deload, it kind of ensures that fatigue dissipates, which reduces your likelihood of sustaining one of these injuries in the long run. And you kind of usually get like the inkling that you should take a deload, or that you should back off or drop the weights or change something up or whatever. Your body gives you these warning signs a little bit in advance. It's when you start to ignore them for way, way too long that things really become problematic. But if you listen to your body along the way, it usually tells you what's up, and then you kind of get the hint before things go bad.
Worse than that, it also leads to poor training practices again prior to the deload. If it were just a week that you lose in terms of training accumulation, I'd be fine with that. But I have found as well that, as I explained to you, the people who engineer their programs by looking at deload weeks in particular end up training in suboptimal fashions prior to the deload week. So if you have let's say arbitrarily a week 5 that is the week pre-deload, well, most of the time what you're going to see is that you're going to do too much on that week, work that your body cannot recover from, because you're going to tell yourself that it's justified because the deload week comes afterwards.
Now, the way I see it, this is not a good reason why somebody should not deload, because this isn't even the fault of the deload itself. And this is, in my opinion, this is in fact actually irrelevant to the actual concept of the deload. Instead, this should be viewed as poor programming or poor training practice or poor self-restraint at that point, right? It's not really the deload's fault, it's your fault. Which, if somebody is falling victim to this sort of pitfall, the pitfall that he's describing here, then to be honest, their regular training program is probably not that much better anyway. So this is kind of setting up a straw man, in my opinion. I don't think it really bolsters his argument. I'm sitting in a hotel room right now, right? And I have zero plans to train this week at all. I'm going to take a week of total rest, which I was just telling you I don't actually do all that often, but I'm going to do it. In part because I feel like I need it, in part because I don't freaking care. I just don't feel like training, right? Now, what did I do last week? I did my own training program, my regular program, nothing more, nothing less, and here we are. So it would just be poor programming and poor training practice if you were to fall victim to this pitfall, but it's not really relevant to the point of needing or not needing a deload.
Understand that the deload week can only help you recover from what your body can recover from, if that makes sense. Meaning that if the work capacity of your bicep is 100 and you took it to 0, to the baseline of 0, if it recovers to 100, that's all it will recover to. It will not go to 120.
This is true. It won't go to 120, but if you have accumulated fatigue, then it wasn't even at 100 to begin with. It was actually probably at 70 or at 80. And then when you let it actually recover, that's when it actually goes back to 100.
You're going to empty the bucket entirely during your pre-deload week, and then you're going to wait until it's fully full again, and you'll think to yourself, okay, well, I got to 100 to 0 to 100, so that's 100 points. This is great. Well, maybe if you had done 2 weeks instead with the deload, you could have taken that same amount in, again, the bucket, get it to 40 on one day, let it recover to 100, that's 60 points, and then 3 days later, empty it again to 40 and let it recover again to 100. That's 120 pounds of recovery, which would be more efficient.
It would be more efficient, but this is assuming that you are always recovering to 100 after every single training session, which is simply not something that's going to happen, right? You might think that you're fully recovered, but you're probably missing, if we're talking about his scale that he keeps referencing here, you're probably missing a few points here and there, right? Because remember, we have to think of it systemically. We have to think of the central nervous system, not peripherally. It's not just about the muscles and the groups of muscles that you're training. It's about the body as a system. And so you miss a few points here and there, and over time those points add up and they accumulate to form meaningful levels of fatigue, chronic fatigue over time. And that chronic fatigue requires an actual reduction in the workload or a reduction in the intensity or both to give the body a chance to make it dissipate, right? And again, this kind of goes back to that myopic, the muscles rule all perspective that I was just talking about in my response to Eugene Tail last week. The muscles don't rule this game, dude. The nervous system is the king, and the muscles, they're not even the prince. They're just the freaking pauper. They are its subject. Training with weights at an intensity level sufficient to build muscle in a natural trainee creates systemic fatigue in the body regardless of the muscle you are training. A hard upper body session can actually affect the lower body because it's the nervous system that ties everything together. And you absolutely cannot talk about fatigue and deloading in this context without bringing up the importance of the nervous system. And once you acknowledge the nervous system, you kind of acknowledge the fact that fatigue accumulates systemically and that it is a wise practice to every now and then allow that fatigue to dissipate.
There is an amount of sandbagging and of repetition of sets that is important in the practice of bodybuilding deloads.
So according to NH, we shouldn't deload because deloading promotes junk volume, but it is necessary to sandbag workouts in the context of what he's now calling a bodybuilding deload, even though the title says he never deloads. And so it kind of sounds to me like these are the same thing, right?
So essentially the way I think about it is that every time recovery allows, the muscle is hit again. So this is when you look at the fatigue accumulated by the muscle and you let that dictate the amount of recovery you're going to give it. The training dictates the recovery.
Again, the body is a system, and ignoring the system as a whole in order to obsess over the constituent parts of the system is not going to allow you to create a framework that promotes optimal long-term growth of the system as a whole.
As I said, I never take weight off of my bar. If I am deadlifting 460, that's what I'm deadlifting. There won't be a day where I come and I touch a 440. Why? Because it's regression. It might make sense for a powerlifter who is going to rebound back up in strength, but for a bodybuilder, I always need to be able to pull 460 so that strength also carries over to my accessories and hip hinges.
Now, this part to me doesn't flow because just because you reduce the external load on the bar doesn't mean that your body is no longer capable of internally producing that much force. And just because you may be training with slightly less weight on the bar doesn't necessitate that your hypertrophy gains would have to be lesser either. You can actually use less weight and still use that lesser weight to gain both strength and muscle when you're thinking of it from the bigger picture. And that has a lot to do with the set and rep ranges as well as intent while you are lifting. But just because these variables are correlated together and often go together or are easiest to manipulate when paired together doesn't mean that they absolutely have to be paired together. And transient reductions in load are not going to impact your long-term gains. In fact, they're probably going to promote more gains in the long run.
This is where evolving rep ranges come into play and why I preach them so much. If you want to have an effective way to manipulate intensity on a daily basis without regressing in performance, you have to use evolving reps and sets. It will ensure that you can always keep the same amount of strength for your strength work and then make up for it somewhere else.
So this is a major point here for me because what I'm hearing is that he is declaring that transient reductions in external load are absolutely cause-effect related to decreases in strength level, and that is simply not true. There are too many other variables that have to be thrown into that mix, but anecdotally, personally, I can ignore heavy weights for months and months and months and still come within 90% of my all-time bests pretty easily, right? So like here, for example, is a 365 zombie squat that I hit a few months ago. That is 90% of my best ever zombie squat. I probably had 10 to 20 pounds in the tank. So in reality, I probably could have gone up to 95% if I really wanted to. And I had not done any squatting, any heavy squatting, or any squatting at all in several months, I believe. I had definitely not done any zombie squatting. And I had only done a random errant rep of squats on other random different variations here and there, really just to test the waters, right? But the point being here, again, transient reductions in load don't cause some immediate massive drop off of any sort, right? And in reality, they're actually a side effect of smart programming. They're definitely not some death sentence to gains.
You come in and you have 1 to 3 sets of 2 to 4 reps. That gives you a wide range of control. If on that day you feel that your strength is not where it should be, or you're pre-fatigued from a previous day, you can just decide to hit 2 reps for 1 set on that day. You maintain performance.
But this isn't really auto-regulation anymore, which is something he was talking about earlier in the video. I can't find that snippet at this point. I didn't write down the timestamp and I kind of lost it. But his main point, one of his main points from earlier, is that he auto-regulates as his means of fatigue management. But if we're forcing a static load on the bar, like he keeps talking about now, then we're not auto-regulating anymore. Auto-regulation dictates fluctuations in load, not just fluctuations in sets and reps.
And then the last facet of bodybuilding deloads is the volume. How do we control volume? Well, it's one of the methods I just described, but one that I particularly like for me and that allows me to continue with that type of training is exercise rotation deloads.
Called it.
If you have the ability to actually have an exercise be shifted with another one, and you have several rotations in place that can be just summoned like this, you'll find that you always will have the ability to do something.
This is about where I figured that we'd be going, which is that he actually deloads, and he actually recommends that you deload also. And I described it earlier, right? And now NH is referring to all these concepts that he's talking about as bodybuilding deloads, which I don't know. I'm going to watch the rest of his video real quick and see if there's anything else that I want to touch on. But what I really want to say is I don't really know why the video is titled what it's titled. He kind of starts off by saying he doesn't deload and you shouldn't either. And then he describes intricate methods of how you should deload throughout the video. And so basically to sum that point up, I agree with all those methods. I don't particularly care for the general method of programming that he talks about throughout his video, but that's kind of ideological differences between bodybuilding training and performance training. Personally, I could care less about bodybuilding as a focused endeavor, as I think that there's more to be gained for the average person by focusing on using the gym to become more well-rounded, right? But again, these are just ideological differences. There's no real right or wrong answer here. Where there is a right or wrong answer is in whether or not you ever need to deload, with the right answer being that it is in fact a necessity which he now acknowledges and describes in detail in his video. So it's been interesting. The title was a little bit clickbaity. So having finished up his video now, I think what I really want to say is the main piece that I really disagree with, or maybe even the only piece that I actually truly disagree with here, is kind of in his adamancy of regarding frequency and duration of training. Because, in my opinion, training 6 days per week, 3 hours per day, it's just kind of excessive, man. And again, maybe that is fine for him, right? But for most people, I don't think that these concepts like that really need to be espoused, because I can see them being worn as a badge of honor. Well, I train more than you, so you're just lazy and I'm better than you because I'm more dedicated. That kind of thing, right? And I can say this confidently that that kind of thinking exists because I used to think that way. I squatted to maximum for something like 90 straight days, even though my progress had stalled out and actually regressed after just a few weeks, because for me, squatting to maximum was a badge of honor. I'd never do it again because I don't believe it to be the way anymore, but at the time, I thought it made me hardcore, right? Weaker and probably more beat up than I needed to be, but fucking hardcore, man. So I just kind of see sentiments like that as kind of promoting inefficiency in a way, right? And I'm sure that's not his intention, because he's not necessarily even telling you guys to train exactly the way that he trains himself. And I don't really know what the programs that he has put out look like, because I've never actually seen them. But I do think that this is something worth noting, because we tend to emulate people that we admire. And so someone who has no business training this way may attempt to copy it just because they think that NH is a cool guy and they heard him talking about how he does it. But even then, even if you can get away with training like this and somehow make equivalent gains over a 5 or a 10-year period, which I still think would be a dubious proposition, because I think that the workload that he describes here is overkill. But even if you could pull that off and make the same amount of gains, it's still inefficient. There's no way around it, because you're not going to make more gains this way over the long term, just like you're not actually going to lose any gains in the long term by taking 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 weeks of total rest from the weights every single year. Really, it's just going to average out over time is what's going to happen. I think the concept of that opportunity cost that he discusses in his video sounds good on paper, but simply doesn't pan out in real life. And as long as you train intelligently and consistently over a long period of time, then you're going to eventually reach your genetic potential, right? You're going to end up in the same place regardless of whether you were training 4 days per week for 90 minutes at a time or 6 days per week for 3 hours at a time, because the body only has so much adaptation capacity. And eventually that's going to level out. It's going to average out. And the true deciding factor is going to be your level of consistency and your level of effort and the intelligence of your programming, right? Not how much that you were training, not training to such an excessive degree. Now, but I'm not saying that high frequency training can't work or that it doesn't work. It certainly has its place, and it's something that I do myself from time to time. I just don't think that it should be your permanent state of training either. I think it has its value when utilized judiciously. So basically what I'm saying is, why spend all this extra time in the gym if you don't have to? Take the freed up time that you would get by trimming the fat from your program and go do something else. Go live your life. Pluck the low-hanging fruit off of another skill that you could learn or whatever. Just do anything else. It sounds like a better allocation of resources to me than spending all this extra time in the gym for, at best, minimal gains, at worst, less gains than you would get in the other scenario. And I think that pretty much covers the major points here, or at least the parts that really stood out to me. I thought that Natural Hypertrophy's video was interesting for sure, and there are definitely some worthwhile takeaways there, and I would definitely encourage you guys to go check his video out as well if you haven't already. Like I said, it's linked below in the description. In the end, we actually seem to be in roughly the same ballpark regarding deloads, at least as far as I can tell. He kind of doesn't seem to like using the word deload, I guess. But the title is why I clicked on the video, so anyway, that's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs. Be sure to sign up for my Patreon. Leave me some love in the comments. Subscribe to my channel. All that good stuff. Keep training hard, and I will catch you guys next time.